The world's watched the occupation in downtown Ottawa for 3 weeks. This past weekend saw the authorities take back the streets for residents who've been living with the headache. One thing the so-called Freedom Convoy did expose was huge cracks in the conservative big blue tent. While some Tory MPs stood back, others willfully egged on the truckers. Cost Erin O Toole his job as leader of the party. While he says he's staying on as MP, it does set up a leadership race for a party that doesn't seem to know its identity. Will it ever unite under one leader? Hello and welcome to Unpublished TV. I'm Ed Hand. With O'Toole now in the rearview mirror, Conservatives now look to a leadership race, and Carleton MP Pierre Poilievre is the presumptive heir apparent, but others have yet to put their name forward. Our Unpublished Vote question asks you, can the Conservative Party be united? And almost 62% said yes, just under 30% said no, and 9% were unsure. However you're watching or listening to our show, whether through our social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, or podcast channels, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and more, I'd like to remind you, you can still cast your vote on this topic at unpublished.vote and then email your MP to tell them why. The Conservative Party of Canada was formed in December 2003 between the Progressive Conservatives and the Canadian Alliance. It aimed to bring all like-minded Tories together, but the factions still existed, and they exploded during the so-called Freedom Convoy. You have to wonder what it's going to take to keep everyone happy, or do they split into two? Joining us to discuss whether the party can unite, Laurie Turnbull is director of the School of Public Administration at Dalhousie University. Warren Kinsella is political commentator and former advisor to Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. And Sam Routley is a doctoral student at Western University. And Laurie, both O'Toole and previously Scheer had some difficulty keeping everyone on the same page. Does that make them weak leaders?
Not necessarily. I think that obviously they both kind of suffered a similar fate in that both seemed to have the support of a consensus in the party. Neither was the front runner. So there's something to be said here, I think, for how the Conservatives are choosing their leaders, the actual mechanism that they're using, because both Scheer and O'Toole came to this, again, not as the front runner candidate, but as the person who was able to coalesce enough support to kind of get over that line on the last ballot. And so both kind of had some work to do in terms of bringing the party together. And the fact that neither of them managed to do it, I don't think is entirely their fault. I think it's because those fault lines in the party are actually quite deep. And when Harper was bringing the party together, there were a lot of people around him, like Tony Clement, who had been part of that Unite the Right movement in Ontario for a long time, and they saw the wisdom of it. And Harper was winning, so there was that reward, right? But now it's not the same, and so the party is still kind of disintegrated.
Warren, Stephen Harper kept them together for more than 10 years, 12 years, as I recall, through fear, as you mentioned in your column. And it seemed he kept that populist side in check in order to win. What happens for the Conservatives if a populist leader is elected? Do the moderates sit back and take it?
Yeah, like Harper had the Saddam Hussein approach to leadership. You just didn't mess with him. And then when he left, everything blows apart. And it does feel like that now. And I have to do a mea culpa, Ed. I was pretty critical of Erin O Toole towards the end of his leadership. I now understand what he was dealing with. He was like the boy with the proverbial finger in the dam. I didn't realize what he was holding together. I think it is dramatic. And I was talking to a former prime minister just a few days ago. And I said, it feels like 91 to me, where, you've got the angry Western populists orbiting away into the Reform Party or some other formulation. And you've got the progressive, conservative, central Canadian establishment are just horrified by what's taken place in Ottawa over the past 3 weeks. And, never shall the twain meet. It feels like that again. And Poilievre, if the party goes for a coronation, if they have a rapid leadership race and decision, I personally think that he would be a disaster. Not because he's an ineffective opposition politician, in question period and committee and all that. It's because he is an effective opposition politician. I don't think anybody could picture him being in government. He's an against government kind of guy. And Canadians don't have an antipathy towards government like he does. So it very much looks like the Conservative Party is in some big trouble. and once again proves my theory that Justin Trudeau is the luckiest guy in Canadian politics.
Sam, your column mentions the rift comes with populism on the rise in Canada. Is that emboldening the ideologues in the party? And what could be the impact in an election?
Yeah, I mean, this conflict between what you can consider a more moderate faction and a more ideological faction is not really new per se. It's something that's characterized the Conservative Party and conservative politics in Canada on the federal level for several decades. But what I sort of indicated is that I feel what's new about now and what sort of revealed itself in the Ottawa demonstration was that this broader populist movement that has taken hold of a lot of other conservative politics in the US predominantly, but to some extent in France and the UK, seems to be showing its face here. That even though resentment against COVID-19 policies is the face of it, it would seem like there's deeper cultural, social, economic factors and a real sense of alienation and displacement that's driving it. And the fact that it's that deep seems to be that even though the Ottawa occupation seems to be over, I think that we're going to see this movement characterize Canadian politics, especially for the Conservative Party in the next couple of years.
Laurie, the populists seem to be more in tune with the People's Party of Canada. Is Max Bernier making hay with the current situation, or does potentially Pierre Poilievre as leader try to bring them back to the Conservatives?
Yeah, I think that's what the Conservatives are trying to do now. They're leaning right to try to capture that vote that went to the PPC to some extent in the last election. And they're hoping that the base stays with them while they do it. But I'm not sure that Bernier is going to make any hay about this. I think it's really hard in Canada to start a new political party and get any traction with it and be able to overcome the regulations that prefer and reinforce the status quo. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there was some of that vote coming back to the Conservatives as they go forward. But it seems like, I agree with what Warren said. I was very surprised to see the shift in the party when Erin O Toole was pushed out. It seemed clear that that was that populist part of the party that had really taken over. And in the caucus, there are enough people, like 73 votes is a lot to against a current leader who's actually, who didn't do so badly in the last election. And so I'm not sure that this is good news for the PPC. It depends on what the Conservatives do with their leadership. I think that it's possible that we're going to see, like, obviously Pierre Poilievre is sort of the front runner right now. We might see some more progressive, moderate Conservatives, people who identify as red Tory, throw their name in the hat. And if they do, it will be a very different conversation. But then it's going to be the factions of the party sort of having it out in this leadership convention while everybody watches.
Warren, the Conservatives seem to lean toward a candidate selections, or they seem to, lean toward candidate selections from the riding associations, but they can be overrun with others with a different agenda than the party. How much does that contribute to the friction between what looks like two parties right now in the Conservative movement?
Well, that's what happened last time. So with Scheer, their complaint was they had too many candidates and the race went too long. So they did what political parties always do. They changed the rules so that it would make it harder for people to enter the race and it would be a shorter race. Well, that favored the social conservatives. And, a couple of the candidates that they had were anointed by the social conservatives. And it just, with greatest respect to any of my social conservative friends, they're poisoning Canadian politics. They're terrific in a conservative leadership race. They're useful there, but you just want to get rid of them. They remind me of the old Richard Nixon maxim, you run as far to the right as you can to get the nomination. As soon as you get it, you start running back. And in the case of both Scheer and O'Toole, they couldn't run back fast enough. But on your earlier question about Bernier, I think it's an important one. There are many conservatives, and all of us have talked to them, who believe that their route to salvation is appropriating the real estate that they think they lost to Maxime Bernier. but I think it's a disastrous strategy if they do that, because if you give voters a choice between the real Max Bernier and the photocopy Max Bernier, they're going to choose the real one 10 times out of 10. So, if that is what their plan is, I think they're going to end up doing even worse under Poilievre if he wins than they did under O'Toole.
You mentioned the center and a lot. Go ahead, Sam.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was going to say that, we talk about a lot of the voters in Canada reside in the middle. And part of Harper's success was moving the middle to the right. So, Warren, has the middle moved back? Is that part of the problem the Conservatives see?
I think 2019 convinced me, started to convince me, and then I really got convinced this fall. Like it's not, and I've said this to Conservatives when they've allowed me into their gatherings to speak, and I beat them up and I'm mean to them. And I say, guys, like it's a liberal country. We've become more diverse. We've become less waspy. We've become more urban. It's just that is the demographic reality. And if you guys continue to be rural, populist, waspy. I understand why you're doing that, because you're comfortable with that, and that's your historic tradition, but you're going to keep losing elections. You've got to change in order to win, the majority, and the majority are in the middle of the road. They're not in the ditches.
Sam, we hear from the populist side of the Conservatives a lot more than we hear from the moderates. And are they being drowned out, and do they get their voice back?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to, within the party currently, it's hard to see the moderates fighting their way back, at least in the next couple of years. I think the fact that, given O'Toole's leadership, they in some sense had their turn to craft a policy program and to direct the party into that more centrist direction. This attempt to appeal to more urban, centrist, liberal-leaning voters. And the fact that leaders tend to get blamed for every problem that the party runs into, regardless of whether or not it's their own fault. They have no real sense of the moderates can't really come from anywhere within the party, and the ideologues feel like it's their turn, and that the way the party ought to pursue ought to lead into the future, and the way it appeals to Canadians is by embracing this more ideological purity, right? Not being apologetic, in their view, for being conservative and having conservative ideals.
Laurie, can the conservative movement in Canada still be relevant with two different parties, much like we had with the PCs and the Alliance?
Relevant, yes, but obviously not an alternative to government unless we move to some sort of acceptance of coalition governments, and we won't, especially not to accommodate fracture on the right side. I think the relevance of it is going to be about whether the current leadership race is going to be able to grow the party. And are there going to be candidates, say, for instance, more than one on the moderate side, who are going to then line up as they drop off the ballot, line up behind a moderate candidate. And then the leader is not totally offside with what the heart and soul of the party wants to do. Immediately with Erin O Toole, you saw that what he wanted to do didn't fit with what the party wanted to do. He was always offside. Now, his tactics to try to build a consensus were clearly ineffective. Some of it is his fault. Some of it is that he basically tried to blindside the party into things like a carbon tax that they weren't prepared to do, and he knew that. Why he thought that was going to be an easy exercise, I have no idea. But it seems to me that there is evidence of some interest in the conservative movement to still have a progressive part, to still have a red Tory part. And I'm in Ottawa now, but I spend a lot of my time in Nova Scotia, where progressive conservatism is alive and well and doing really well politically. 3 of the 4 premiers in Atlantic Canada are progressive conservative. These are not ideological people that you wouldn't know, right? And it's almost to the other extreme. You wouldn't know which party they were with, but they're winning majority governments on progressive conservative tickets. And so it's not like it's dead, right? It's just, what are the federal conservatives going to do to be able to be successful?
Warren, can some see a leadership race as renewal for the party, but if it still has the same policies, faces, and attitudes, is it going to get any further?
No, and especially if they're auditioning for the job they've already got. They're so angry. Like, you guys, you got to come up with some ideas. You got to have kind of a positive vision for the country. The trucker thing was just relentlessly negative and awful to look at. And there was only one political party there, like, cheering them on and bringing them coffee. Like, that's just not a formula for government. And, Lori in Nova Scotia would know what she was saying is so true. Like, Peter MacKay won 50% of the vote last time. And to me, he's the type of candidate, maybe he's not the candidate, he's the type of candidate that they need, because, we're a big country. We're a big, diverse country with lots of competing interests. You need somebody who has an ability to reconcile all those diverse interests. And, those centrists in the traditional Mulroney or MacKay or what have you are the ones who have a tendency to do better at that, and therefore do better in elections. And of course, that's the historic success of the Liberal Party of Canada, is it straddles the middle and squeezes out the other two parties to the edges. And the same thing, it's happening again. Although I guess in the case of Singh, he's been subject to a friendly takeover by the Liberal Party of Canada. But I mean, it's just, Trudeau occupies so much real estate now, and the Conservative Party, instead of fighting that and pushing back, is relegating itself more and more to the right side of the spectrum. I don't get it. Because as I say, I think they're going to do worse in the next election under Poilievre than they did under O'Toole.
You had mentioned that the Conservative Party was the only one that you saw at the convoy, and the convoy organizers were saying that they want to talk to the Prime Minister. They wanted to talk to the Prime Minister. Do you think that was part of the plan? We're just not going to talk, not engage, and not be seen with them.
No, I think, I wrote a couple of columns saying he should meet with them. Right. And I know, we all knew what was going to happen. They were going to yell at him, probably throw things at him. And he just remains there and looks stoic and look like a prime minister. He'd win a majority in the next election, because he would look like a normal person. They would look like a bunch of assholes, because they were a bunch of assholes. And so, the way I think you deal with those people, I've been writing about the far right for a long time, is you try not to give them legitimacy. You try not to give them, airwaves, but they own the airwaves for 3 weeks. So I thought it was a fool's errand for Trudeau to just ignore that. You could see at the early part of the thing, it was like this pendulum. At the early part of it, he was just pretending like they weren't there. Was crazy. And then he went to the opposite extreme, and as Emergencies Act and all kinds of other stuff. I thought there was a middle course for him politically, where he could have looked like a prime minister and played judo with the presence of the truckers, but he didn't do that.
Sam, when you look back at the leadership race between Andrew Scheer and Max Bernier, and it was a close one. You think that might have been when we started to see the populist side was starting to get strong and a little more vocal?
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent, I think Bernier in that race was trying to run on a more libertarian stick, but once he had lost that race, he kind of seized on this populist momentum opportunistically as a way to advance his own success. But I think when you're talking about why the Conservative Party, especially the more ideological wing, is doing what they're doing, I think it's important to recognize that they think that the country's on their side in some sense. They think that there's this silent majority, in a sense, right? That a growing number of Canadians, in their view, even though they're not indicating it publicly, even though they're not expressing in polling per se, are starting to have this growing resentment against things like government overreach, sort of cancel culture, in their view, and they're thinking that if they pursue this more ideologically pure direction, right, a very firm anti-establishment, confrontational style of politics, that a lot of Canadians who are for now in the shadows are gonna kind of come out very, very quickly, and is going to catch what they consider to be the Salic Laurentian elite off guard.
Why do you think that these people seem to think that it's so many, a majority are behind them? Because, as you mentioned, according to polling, according to letters to the editor, whatever, that doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, I mean, they look at instances like the Trump takeover of the Republican Party and his subsequent election. If you go back to 2016, even though in retrospect it's very clear how he had a path there, I think a lot of conservatives look back at that period and see how the establishment, in their view, whether that's media or academia or government officials, it really had no sight of it coming, and they feel like something similar to that is going on in Canada. A lot of it is wishful thinking, quite honestly. A lot of it is anecdotal, in the sense that conservatives will naturally hang around other conservatives, and from that come to believe that the rest of the country is like.
Lori, do you see someone in the Conservative Party right now that possibly could unite and keep the message for the party?
I mean, some of the names that have been thrown around are interesting. Tasha Carleton is an interesting name. I don't know that there's anybody who really stands out as, wow, this could be a real game changer. I think there are people like James Moore, Ronna Ambrose, who could have been those people and decided right off the bat that they didn't want to participate. So I'm not sure there's a unicorn in the offing here, but there could be. But it's still going to be like, whoever is in the position, I think it's going to be difficult. It's going to be really hard work, and it's going to be more than one person. I think it's possible that, like, in the same way that we saw social conservative candidates drop off the ballot and line up behind Erin O Toole, an interesting dynamic would be for progressive candidates to drop off the ballot and line up behind a progressive candidate, who then would win with a sense that there has been a coming together of the party during the process of picking a leader. Because if you get this sense where every time there's a new leader, the party is completely torn apart, and the job of the leader is not to harness the energy toward a vision for the country. The job instead is to constantly try to reconcile irreconcilable differences. That's never going to win for anyone, and that's impossible. You can't, and the leader loses energy trying to do that, and the person's not able to command the kind of authority and legitimacy on the national stage as they should. So it seems I think a short leadership race would be a bad idea at this point. I think they need some time, although I get the Prime Minister is throwing around the word confidence today. And so if the vote, I think he'll win this vote, but if he didn't, an election would be in the offing. And so I understand the need for some urgency about it.
How about you, Warren? Do you see somebody who is in the Conservative Party right now that might be able to bring all sides together?
Nope. No idea. No, I don't. And neither do voters. And that's their problem. They've got a purity test going on now, where they want Attila the Hun. And, whenever I write something about a Peter MacKay or Jean Charest, people who are experienced, successful politicians, it's, you work for Jean Chrétien, what do you know? And we need a real conservative. And it's like, well, guys, you've had a real conservative for the past couple races, for the most part. And what has it gotten you? You've lost to somebody who I consider to be the weakest prime minister we've had in generations. I think he's been a terrible prime minister, and you lost against him. The cliched, Scheer and O'Toole can't score on an empty net. It's true. They couldn't score on an empty net. And so it looks like they're going to do it again. And then I could easily see some of the progressive conservatives saying, to hell with this. You guys go on and, do your rageaholic routine, and we're going to go and try and do something else. And, that's a surefire formula to give the Liberal Party power for the next generation.
Sam, what do you think? Is there a moderate in the Conservative Party right now that you think could bring everybody together and keep the message together?
No, not right now. I think you're going to see the moderates are going to start to make their exits, whether that's back into the private sector or provincially as well. I think, like Lori mentioned earlier, there's still a place for progressive conservatives, more red Tories within a provincial level, if not including Nova Scotia, but also Ontario to some extent. And you might see something where Poilievre wins the leadership and he has his chance, and he brings in his people and he brings in his team. And if that is not successful, you'll then see a sort of regrouping and challenge in the next couple of elections.
So they'll be on the outside looking in for quite a while then.
Yeah. I think, I mean, unless Poilievre or the next leader manages to win the election, I think there's still some pendulum to the Canadian elections, in the sense that there might be, within the next couple of years, such a strong anti-liberal sentiment, a strong desire for change, that the voters are willing to bring in anyone else. And if that happens, which would be totally out of the Conservatives' control, you might see some moderates kind of come back in opportunistically, now that there's a shot at power.
Lori, I'm kind of wondering, we talk about the Conservatives, the progressives, and then the populists. It'd be nice to talk more about policy than anything else, and you had mentioned before, when we were talking about Brian Mulroney and how he was able to keep it together, there were big issues on the table at that point. You think there's no big issue that everybody can the whole party can rally around?
I mean, it's not the same as when the big issue was free trade and the big issue was national unity. It's hard to get, it's hard to top those things, and it's hard to get into the realm of those things. Most everyday politics are not those things. But to be honest, I think, like, in the aftermath of COVID, when we are opening up again and life is going to be very different, we are on a verge potentially of a serious class conflict in Canada, which we haven't had to the same extent as the US has had in our politics. We've tended to be divided by different things. But if we do see a growing wealth gap, we see the difference between people who were able to actually do better during COVID-19 financially and other people who were just shaken by it and are having a harder time recovering. I think part of what we're seeing on the Conservative side now is that there is an ideological shift where the same ideological forces, direction, spectrum doesn't answer all the questions about where you are politically, where you are ideologically. I think it's different now. It's not just about the right and appealing, center right, far right, all that. I think there are some ways in which the NDP and the Conservatives are both now competing for the support of the working class, who feel that the measures that were taken by the government to manage the economic crisis during COVID-19 have not helped them. And so I think there are lots of issues, to be honest, for the Conservatives to grab onto.
But Warren, if that's the case, they're just shooting themselves in the foot, fighting amongst each other, right?
Yeah, well, fighting amongst yourself, in a political party is always fatal. Just benefits your opponent. But I strongly agree with Lori. At first, I kind of believed the truckers, that it was about COVID. Maybe it was about getting rid of Trudeau. But I do believe, and it was, of all things, it was an opinion piece in the New York Times yesterday. It's really about class war, and the piece basically talked about how the class war has come to Canada, and there are people like us, frankly, who can conduct a life and earn a living on Zoom, right, and not have to worry about the stuff that the trucker does, who has to get out and go do things, or the person who serves us coffee at a Tim Hortons or in Brampton or what have you. There's these different lives, these different universes, and the ones in the kind of the doing universe are angry at us and they're lashing out. And I agree with what both my co-panelists have said. I think that this is not going to go away. It's possibly going to get worse. And it just, to my surprise, it's not about COVID. It's not about Trudeau. It's about a class resentment. It's kind of like what we saw with Occupy and the Tea Party about a decade ago. It looks like it's back.
Well, folks, a great discussion on the future of the Conservative Party. I want to thank our guest today on Unpublished TV, Laurie Turnbull, Director of the School of Public Administration at Dalhousie University. Warren Kinsella is a political commentator and former advisor to Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. And Sam Routley is a doctoral student at Western University. And I want to thank you for watching Unpublished TV. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.